Hello, this is Jamie Batchy. I chose to do my topic brief on individual education plans, specifically when there is a dispute on the plan between families and the district or the school. Many times, and I'm sure everyone else has been in the situation, I've sat through multiple IEP meetings and been concerned when the parents didn't bring up a question that I found relevant. But my hands were tied. I wasn't able to bring up something like that. And wondering how informed parents were and how informed they legally should be on the proceedings and everything in the educational world that we understand, but sometimes parents don't, or they just trust us to make sure that we're doing what's great and what's right for their child. So some of those things brought up a need for me to understand really what was legally required for the district to inform the parents about and what the process was when we didn't agree. So that was what mainly brought me to this topic. A couple big things that brought up were the different views between regular education teachers and special education teachers on the views of their parents, as well as the combined need for both of their teachers to have a good relationship with the students' parents, so that when disagreements do happen, we can come to a mediation about them without any legal involvement. But again, that's the perfect world. So, a couple terms to go over that we need to understand is first the Individuals with Disabilities Act, often referred to as IDEA. Even though in 2004 it was modified, amended to become the IDEIA with the Individual Improvement Act, the Individual with Disabilities Improvement Act. Also, but most educators just call it IDEA instead, or IDEA if you want. Another one is Free Appropriate Public Education, FAPE, which we referred to multiple times in class, but it was really good to dig deeper into what that really means, because it's often kind of a broad understanding of what it is. It's basically the right that every child has to an individual education at no expense to the families. However, when that free appropriate public education comes into question, then the ultimate or the final judgment is up to the state educational agency, and that's stated in IDEA in section 1411, which was interesting. How broad that can be, yet how well defined it was stated as well. Then we need to understand local educational agency, often referred to the LEA, basically districts, charter schools, any local educational agency that's dealing with kids. And least restricted environment, defined as the ideal placement for students, unless there is a need for a more restricted environment. I went over it briefly, but the history of IDEA, pre-1975, many students or children with disabilities were not allowed into a public education system for multiple reasons, or for the understanding that they were incapable of learning. And when that was modified and enacted in 1975, it was under the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. And that in 1990 it was further amended and added to become IDEA, and then again in 2004, approved again. Mostly in that act, in the IDEA Act, it's section 412 that we're dealing with individual education plans, though 411, 412, 414, they're all involved in the system. So I got to dig nice and deep into this. A couple questions that were brought up and I was able to answer was specifically who qualifies first under IDEA. Basically, any of the disabilities, and there's a long list including autism, blindness, deafness, emotional disturbance, hearing impairment, mental retardation, or intellectually disabled. multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impaired, specific learning disabilities, speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury, and visual impairment. So a broad list of anything that may impact their learning. Again, the free and appropriate public education is defined just as the right every child has to an individual free education. An IEP team came up multiple times as any teacher, or at least one regular education teacher, who is working with that student, the special education teacher, the parents, the family, and one administrator from the LEA, or the LEA representative. Often when parents or families disagree, the first step is to go into mediation. We'll go into more of that a couple slides later. When that doesn't work, then they can go into a legal dispute process and possibly a court case. When parents think about the rights they have, many of these rights are put into a document called the Procedural Safeguards. And most of us, and I know before this, I've just seen it as a booklet handed to parents at an IEP and said, we're required to give this to you. And that's kind of what brought up this whole thing, that we need to make sure parents are understanding the rights that they have with their student. One way that we can make sure that they are is making sure some of these questions are answered affirmatively. And these were some questions that got brought up to make sure that parents were getting due process when there was a disagreement. And many of them just have to do with communication for the entire process, communicating their rights. For example, the fourth bullet point is most parents may not have equal expertise in areas of education or law. Is a sufficient enough explanation being provided to bridge the knowledge gap? Many of us would not be able to go into a different field and understand what they're talking about. And we need to make sure that parents are understanding. In addition, in the case of physically or mentally disabled parents themselves, are we making it clear to provide, or that they can provide, a liaison available to facilitate communication between both parties to make sure that everyone's being understood? Common reasons for dispute are the placement of the student. Is it the least restrictive environment, or should it be a more restrictive environment? A quality of services, including the certification level of the teachers or para-educators that are working with that student, is also a common dispute topic. The IEP goals. One interesting thing that was brought up as I was doing the research is the understanding that a student's IEP goals, unless they are intellectually disabled, they fall into a different category. But most students' IEP goals should match their grade level standards. So if we're seeing goals and they're providing the special education aides or department are providing services for those goals should be matching their age grade level standards. And I'll get into what I found a little bit about the consistency of that later. Assessment methods is another dispute topic, a proposed change in the student discipline. It's proposed, or it has happened. When we think about the process, we always, in any dispute, whether it's legal or not, we need to attempt to work it out. And some of the nice things is a lot of the mediation process can happen with a state-approved or district-sent mediator, a specific person there. Mediators must be present to be the back and forth between the two parties to make sure that we're understanding everything and trying to solve the process. Unfortunately, if that proves ineffective, then process goes to a hearing. Very few cases actually go to court, but as I was reading through the different sections under IDEA for this court hearing process, there were extensive legal requirements for what needs to go on between both parties to make this legal, approved, and the financial impacts on both of them. And though few cases go to court, it really is still up in the air on what cases do get funded. I did some research and I heard multiple explanations between the districts don't want to use taxpayer money to pay for this, and the courts or the judges don't want to have them pay for it, the taxpayers, so they'll often dismiss a case. But I've also heard and researched other cases where the district just doesn't want to pay for any more court fees and just gives in because it'll be a cheaper process to pay for either a private education for that student or otherwise. So it really was up in the air a little bit, but doing the research was okay. As I took a little survey and I sent it out through social media to multiple regular education teachers. So regular education teachers between K-12. And the majority of the responses that I got were in the upper elementary, junior high, middle school range. That was where most of the responses were coming from. The first question I asked was how students are receiving services. I wanted to know what the quality of services they were getting. And the first one, the blue, the dark blue on this graph, this is for elementary. The dark blue on this graph was specifically talking about the majority of my students are pulled out of their regular education classes to be worked with a special education provided aid on that. And we can see in the elementary that that's where the majority of teachers had their students coming from. In the secondary, however, the results were quite different, and this was really surprising to me, that the majority of secondary teachers, 6-12, again, mostly the middle school range, chose the option that it's up to me to provide services for the student, that they don't get any outside help from the special education department. And thinking how ineffective that may be to provide quality services to IEP students when you're the teacher providing regular education and special education to those. So that was an interesting discovery in there. The second question I asked was regarding the IEP goals matching the grade level standards referred to earlier. And in elementary, most of them said yes, but you can see that still almost 36% of the 62 responses that I got said no, they match lower grade standards. So there still is a little bit of inconsistency when it comes to matching grade level standards that I did find interesting when I found clear evidence and legal evidence that they were supposed to be matching grade level standards. In the secondary, the results were very similar. The majority, again, yes, but still quite a high percentage for saying no. So one discovery that means is we need to be a little bit better about making sure when we're looking at IEPs that we're supporting the students' high achieving goals, that they're not being set too low. Major thoughts from teachers that I received was that the teachers wished for more collaboration between special education and regular education teachers. Also, frustration about full inclusion students where they receive little support. IEPs don't have a legal standard of continuity as far as how they're written. There is something about what is on there, but how they're written and the goals needed to be a little better. And lastly, teachers felt true needs were being covered up by short-term solutions due to lack of time, staff, and money. And we as teachers know that the not enough phrase is very common in our field, and that impacts some things. In regards to this course and the learning goals, it was good to review and learn some of the new terminology, such as the wording used in IDEA. In addition, digging deep into federal and state code. That was a good experience. And just the big picture for me was figuring out how all this legal code impacts the daily running of the education system and the students in it, and my job specifically as a regular education teacher. I included a couple of references with